You're listening to Explain That by Velocity Legal, the podcast that keeps business owners and professional advisors ahead of the curve in an ever-changing legal landscape.
In recent years, land values have spiraled. Business owners who are considering selling land may be making significant capital gains. Those capital gains can be shielded from tax if the small business concessions apply. The difference can be massive in terms of after-tax dollars. Without careful planning, landowners could be faced with unexpected and substantial tax liabilities. Today I'm joined by Tyson Bateman, and we'll be talking about how to use the small business CGT concessions on selling land. Welcome to the show, Tyson.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. I understand one of your passions as a tax lawyer is the small business concessions.
Yeah, I love it. It's a very important area. It's one of the greatest tax concessions we have and often not well understood. Its application can have great results for people that use it properly, but misunderstanding it can have some consequences as well.
And it can make sort of not quite make or break, but make a significant difference to the amount of money that the business owner has left with after a sale.
Definitely. If you look at the design of it, it was designed for business owners and small business people who perhaps have worked their whole life in a business, haven't had the benefit of perhaps some other employment obligations of others. So the small business concessions are meant to help those people out. So accessing them are very important.
Yeah. And of course, taxpayers care about, the after-tax dollars. So, the amount before a sale is not as important as what they're going to be left with after tax.
Definitely. It's the after-tax profits that you're living with the rest of your life. So that's the important number to many of our clients. So it's important on understanding that number and not just whatever's on the sale agreement.
Yeah, absolutely. So Tyson, you mentioned these small business concessions. Now, they've been around for a while and they are pretty complicated. Today, I want to get into the application to land because it can apply to other things as well. But today we're talking about land. And I guess one of the trends over time is the appreciation of value in land, whether it's on the urban edge or the fringe of an urban area, or it's infill, but land everywhere. It's gone up quite a lot. And landowners could be facing pretty significant capital gains.
Definitely. The appreciation and increase in land prices, whether it's residential, rural, commercial, these present significant capital gains. And often for many people, it might be the significant asset that's the wealth for the family. So consideration needs to be given on what's the most tax-effective way to dispose of this asset, considering it is such a large part of people's wealth often. It's important to keep in mind that, you've got a business asset, but if you've got a land asset as well, sometimes the same concepts can apply. The tests need to be a little bit different, so there's a few things to keep in mind, but certainly land is an important part of disposing anyone's business. And
some of the matters that come across your desk, CGT was introduced in 1985. A lot of the times there'll be late 80s, early 90s, and the lands, have gone up 5 times, 10 times even sometimes.
Definitely. We're seeing it a lot with urban sprawl on the fringes of cities. Some of this land used to be zoned rural, and as we expand further and further out, when it gets rezoned to residential, it's a significant increase. So these capital gains can be absolutely massive. Accessing the small business CGT concessions can be a great way to reduce the tax impost on that.
And with that, the tax office in recent years, these concessions haven't changed all that much over the last few years. There has been some changes in some case law, but one sort of development is the ATO's sort of looking pretty stringently at some of these claims.
Definitely. I think because it is, such a beneficial concession, the ATO doesn't want people claiming them that aren't entitled to it. So you do have to be mindful of that if you are going to claim it, that you do get advice and seek advice and be sure that you can. Some of these concessions can totally disregard the total gain. That's a massive concession. So the ATO rightly dedicates a lot of attention to some of those claims. Yeah,
you could be talking about, a capital gain in the millions of dollars and, with the conditions, if you fail just one of them, it's sort of yes or no, right?
Exactly. If you fall over at one point, it doesn't matter if you pass the many other gateways to get through. So you've got to make sure at every step along the way that you're confident that you pass that test.
Yep. Well, I guess the technical aspect that I want to get into today is this active asset test, because that's sort of one of the gateways into these concessions. Now, what types of land could we be looking at in sort of thinking about these small business concessions?
Yeah, so it's land that needs to be used, or another one is ready for use in a business. So in a business setting, typically the easiest one that I can think of is a commercial property that's used to run the business of a business owner. But that's not to say that a rural property with primary production can't be used that way. And sometimes even residential property, if someone's conducting their business from home, can also be used in that way.
Yeah, and I guess the key is that business use is by the owner or someone related to them rather than someone unrelated.
That's right. There are some deeming provisions about being connected with or affiliates of, which are important to keep in mind, but it's not necessarily the person that owns the business owns the land has to run the business, but it's important to keep those tests in mind.
Yeah. So when we're talking about this active asset test, we're looking at things like, okay, was it farmland? Was it a commercial property? And then the identity of who's run the business.
Yeah, and it really comes down to the way in which it was used. In a commercial setting, if you've got a bricks and mortar business where people are attending and there's been, a lease there for some time, it's pretty clear that's used in that business.
Yeah.
It becomes a bit more of a grey area perhaps if you've got some land that perhaps sat vacant or perhaps wasn't in a business that was particularly active. So you need to be mindful of how it's been used and what it's been used for in order to satisfy that test.
Yeah, because that's the thing with land. I mean, it's not like, goodwill in a business where land could change over time or it could be used for different things or, there could be a question mark whether it's a business or not.
Definitely. So it's important to look at the whole period of ownership for this sort of test, and in particular, what was it used for through the whole period.
Yeah. And Tyson, I know that, there's been some litigation on this active asset issue in the last little while. We had the Eichmann litigation, which was about sort of how much of the land needs to be used.
Yeah, that was an interesting case and one of the few cases that has looked at the small business concessions, and one I think many tax advisors welcomed. Importantly in that, the judges found that the concessions are a concession and so they should be interpreted that way and more beneficially to the taxpayers. So with that in mind, I had a look at how much of the land was used in order for the active asset test. In that case, it was a very small amount. It was a man that was holding stock and things on the land, and that was held to be an active asset. So you can see that even with a small amount of use that seems to be not integral or not a major part of the business, it is possible for it still to be used in the business.
Yes, yeah, and it's not 50%. It doesn't have to be sort of 51% or 100% or something as high as
That's
that.
right. That's right.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to farmland because I know you've had some dealings there. Now, of course, farmland is probably less of that kind of issue. It's either farmland or it's not. But I guess one of the main issues, with farmland is this business requirement. Is it a business?
Yeah, that's right. Compared to, say, a commercial property with a commercial business that it's very clear that there's a business being conducted on it, the farmland can sit there vacant or the business on it might not be a business. It cannot be as clear. So there are some little quirks when it comes to farmland to keep in mind. Of course, when you're looking at large-scale primary production operations, the answer can be quite clear. If there's someone that's, cropping every year with large investments of labour, large investments of capital, that's a bit clearer. But when you start getting towards your small-scale operations, sometimes your hobby farms, the question of are you carrying on a business is an important one.
Yeah, and they could have been, situations where land was purchased, 20, 30 years ago in an area that was, let's pick Melbourne as an example. It was clearly not in the suburbs, and now we've had urban sprawl, and all of a sudden, developers are knocking on their door saying, "Hey, we want to buy this," and then they're sort of thinking at that stage, well, am I going to get these concessions or not?
Yeah, and it's interesting because at that point, the bread's almost baked. They're coming to you with either a sale in mind or perhaps a sale has happened, and you're looking back over the life of the land and how it was used. And with this test, you really need to look at if it was used in a business for the entire period. So, this involves an analysis of the entire time what business was undertaken. And using this example, sometimes you might have it, someone bought it for a couple of years, it sat dormant, it was largely vacant, and then perhaps they've put some sheep or some cows in there. It's been pretty low scale. And so it's difficult in that way when that's already occurred. The facts are already set in and you can't really change much. But at the same time, there are ways in which you can try it. If it's before a sale, for example, that you can try and set yourself up in order to give yourself the best chance to be carrying on a business. Importantly, coming back to that active asset test, one of the key ones, you need to be an active asset for at least 7.5 years of the ownership period or half of it. So if you've got a 20-year ownership period, it's only 7.5 years that you need to be an active asset for. So if we're using that example again, there's a couple of years where it's sat dormant, there's a few years where there's some cows, and then perhaps there's a change in business. Well, it's important to go year by year and analyse and see, all right, perhaps in this year I wasn't carrying on a business, but how about this period? So it really is an analysis of the entire time and the way the land was used for that test.
Yeah. So what you're saying is, if you get over that 7.5 years, then it's in.
That's right. And like some people sometimes front load that 7.5 years. So it could have been a 7.5 year use right at the start, and otherwise it sat dormant for quite some time.
Yeah.
For the active asset test, that's passed. There might be some other considerations elsewhere, but the active asset test, that gets in.
Yeah. And when you're sort of, discussing with clients and, considering that, is it an active asset? Is it a business? What type of questions are you asking? What factors are you sort of considering?
Yeah. So the main one that the ATO particularly focuses on is this intention to make a profit, which is a bit of a funny one because, it's not actually making a profit, but it's an intention to. It's a sort of a bit of a grey subject, but often we're requesting from clients like every bit of documentation they have, show us your financial statements, show us any purchase records, sales records, these sorts of things that go towards showing that you had an intention of making a profit from the business. I've never sat there and be like, oh, I've got too many documents from the client from here. So I think, you want as many documents as possible that show that, there was an intention to buy stock, to care for the stock, to farm the crops, anything that shows that there was meant to be a business undertaken in this way.
Understood. Because essentially the ATO is saying if you're not in it to make a profit at some point, then you're not carrying on a business, because business and profit are integral to each other.
Yeah, that's right. And just from our experience, it's a much easier argument to make if there's profit, even a small amount of profit from the business undertakings.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that no profit cuts you out.
Yeah.
But it just makes it a harder argument to make if you've sat there for multiple years, you've done the same thing, you've copped losses many years in a row. The ATO doesn't look kindly on that in terms of just loss year, and no change in the business. That's where the documentation is really important. And there's got to be a bit of a story, I think, for these things. You need to be able to tell the ATO, like, this was our intention, this is why it didn't work, after we did this and we changed to this. These are often long periods of time, and if there isn't a change in behaviour for the taxpayer and they're just copping loss after loss, it's difficult to say there was any business undertaking there.
Yeah, I understood. It's sort of like at some point, you would expect there to be a profit. But I guess, two things to that is Australia, we're a land of natural disasters, it seems, fires, floods, droughts, etc. Those things can impact, they have a massive impact on primary production, first point. And then the other point is, just because you're in business doesn't mean you've been in business before or are good at business.
Yeah, that's right. Even a bad business owner's in business. And it's one thing, I guess, to satisfy that from a technical perspective. The ATO convincing is a little bit different. So we've almost got to have a better position than the technical position to convince the ATO of some of these things.
Well, turning to that point of convincing the ATO, sort of what would you normally see in terms of that convincing the ATO? What does that sort of look like? Yeah,
so convincing the ATO, you can either do it as a preparatory step and often with a private ruling, and this is useful if there hasn't been a sale agreement in place, or perhaps you've got a client who isn't quite wedded to selling yet but just wants to get their affairs in order. So for certainty, you can approach the ATO for a private ruling, and because these are such fact-dependent scenarios, they're often very tedious and there's a lot of documentation required. The ATO has a few rulings out where they will ask for certain documents such as business plans, your financial statements, your estimates. And in that, the story is key, I think. It's a lot of documents, and crafting the private ruling application is really important. Often these things will fall over from lack of documentation. So I come back to, at every chance, people should be documenting anything that evidences that there was a business undertaken in this space. If a client doesn't want to go to the ATO, alternatively, a wrap paper is an alternative, a reasonably arguable position paper. And in doing that, we would be provided with as many documents as possible. We would undertake a fulsome review and then provide our position based on case law at that time.
And that's essentially sort of a sort of front ending that, well, the ATO may look at this later on, and essentially you've got all your ducks in a row.
That's right. That's right. The alternative is sometimes, I guess, the event has already happened, and perhaps you've made a decision to claim the CGT concessions, and you're being part of a review. Once you're in the review land, the stakes are a little bit higher.
Of course.
If you've claimed the small business CGT concessions, which have provided you with a great tax relief, whether you're in or you're out, could be a very, very significant tax impost, plus any penalties or interest applied on that. So in that way, it's always best to prepare first and get ahead of it. And so we'd always recommend getting ahead of it and getting advice before any sort of CGT event.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And one sort of thing I've observed is we've talked about that active asset test, that once you get through that 7.5 years, it's always an active asset. And with these, blocks of land, things can change over time. It's, it could have been a business at one point and things could be different. And I've seen at least, some situations where there's sort of been an incorrect thought that, well, because there's no business now, there's no small business concessions.
Definitely. That's important. Coming back to, once you're an active asset, you're in. The small business CGT concessions, they can be a bit technical and complex, but there are these little helping rules in there that once you're in for the active asset test. So just because the land isn't being used now doesn't mean you can't access the small business CGT concessions.
And to pick up on that point, even if the tax return's already been done on the basis that there's no concessions, it's not too late even at that point, is it?
No, you can go back and amend your assessments as long as they're in time. So certainly not too late if perhaps you've made a lodgement on the basis that you don't think you get the small business concessions, but you feel like maybe I do now. Certainly you can review that and amend that assessment. And
of course, there could be very significant dollars at stake with this type of thing. So the exercise could be well worth it.
Definitely.
Tyson, one point I wanted to come back to is you made the point that, in this active asset test, it's got to be a business that's somehow connected with the owner of the land. And you said that it's a complicated test. What is sort of the gist, or what's sort of involved in that test?
Yeah, so it would involve an analysis of the relationship between the landowner and the business owner. And it can get quite complex because you trace through ownership. There's also these concepts of control and acting in concert. So it's not automatic would be how I would say, just because you've got two businesses that you think are related. It does require an analysis of the full connected with an affiliate test. In most cases, if you've got a single controller, it should apply, but it's not automatic. So these things really need to be taken care of if you've got a case where you've got a separate land owning entity from a business owning entity. Yeah,
and that's sort of pretty common usually, that it's not a individual that owns the land and also is the one running a business as a sole trader.
Yeah, it's not just given the way that business structures are set up. Sometimes there's asset protection considerations, sometimes it's tax considerations. It's very common to have separate entities set up. So it's another piece that just needs to be considered with the small business concessions.
Yeah, and it might be, there's a trust for the land, and then the business is in a company, and then that company is owned differently, and maybe there's different family members involved, or maybe it's sort of a co-ownership type situation. So there's all sorts of different permutations.
Yeah, and they need to be considered because, again, it's not automatic. Although someone might consider that they own both pieces of land, it does come down to who's actually the ownership entity. So it's important to keep in mind.
And of course, that could change over time as well, because structures change over time too.
Definitely, especially now with some of these large families that have passed down through generations. It's not automatic that the land is owned the same as the business. So important to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Tyson, turning back to sort of the practical takeaways and what sort of someone who's advising a landowner or the landowner themselves would need to know. Let's say they're considering selling, and there's some sort of business activity somewhere. What would you suggest as the sort of things that they should be thinking or going through their mind?
Yeah, they should be engaging specialist advisors as soon as possible. Pre-planning on these is key. Getting everything in a row before a CGT event can really be helpful. Although these are great lengths of time that often the land is owned, you can still position yourself before the event happens. So I would be engaging with a specialist as soon as possible, trying to get their view on the active asset test, the carrying on a business test, trying to see if you can position yourself to get a small business CGT concessions. Even if that's not on your radar, I would be advising anyone to just document as much as possible any of their business undertakings, particularly if you've got a business that perhaps isn't as well advanced, isn't as large scale as something that's you can see first off that's a business. So if you've got any small scale rural primary production activities going on, document as much as you can, take photos, keep records. These things are integral to down the line when you come to answering these questions.
Evidence is key. I mean, with the onus being on taxpayers to prove things, evidence is absolutely key. And we haven't mentioned the other conditions for the small business concessions, but of course in that review, you'd be looking at those other things that could make or break something, and maybe there could be something done differently to satisfy that condition.
Yeah, that's right. And particularly if you're in an ATO review scenario, they're not just looking at carrying on a business or your active asset test. They're reviewing your whole entire situation. So it's important to get engaged early. If you have a significant land asset, you think the small business CGT concessions could apply, you need to confirm that well before any CGT event happens.
Yeah. And if someone's a landowner or advisors thinking about getting that assistance, how would they engage with you, and what sort of would that look like?
Yeah, so I'd suggest you contact us, and often we just undertake a very preliminary review in the first instance and just get a feel for how the small business concessions could apply to you, potentially flag some issues, and then from there, if there's a CGT event on the horizon or perhaps one to happen, we can provide specialist advice from there.
Yeah, and sometimes it's clearly yes, clearly no, and sometimes it falls in the
that's
grey.
right. Some of these questions, it's yes or no. Many of them fall in the grey, and that's where some advice really helps.
Fantastic. Well, thanks once again, Tyson, for being part of this episode. And I'd encourage anyone with any questions to reach out to Tyson about the small business concessions and land.
Thanks, Andrew.